Welcome to Woodwork for Humans, the series where we make great things out of wood using very basic tools. Last week we made these tri-squares, and they came out great. You should check out the video if you haven't seen it already. But one feature of making these is we had to mark out the lines to make this bridle joint back here, and that required very careful, precise marking. And I had a little workaround trick where we used pieces of scrap against the bench, and that got us through the project. It was fine. But for doing accurate layout for joinery, what you really want is a marking gauge. This is the ideal tool. But the problem is, if you go on Amazon, you find marking gauges that are either fancy and nice looking but sort of expensive, or you can find inexpensive ones but they don't look very good and the reviews are mediocre. So instead of spending too much money or settling for a bad tool, I think that we should make our own marking gauges. They'll be totally free, made from scrap, accurate, precise, dependable, and easier to use than most commercial gauges. Wow, I just made a lot of promises there. I really hope this video comes out okay. Okay, so the basic English pattern marking gauge is a very simple tool. It has a beam right here. This part is usually called either the fence or the stock. It has a cutter, which can be a pin, or sometimes it's more of a blade, and then there's some sort of locking mechanism. In this case, it's a big wooden thumb screw. That's the entire tool. What marking gauges really excel at is scribing lines parallel to a reference surface. So for instance, let's say I wanted to make a 1/2 inch wide rabbet in the edge of this board. I would take my marking gauge and set it to a 1/2 inch using the appropriate chisel as a reference. Then I'll set my gauge against the face of the board. That's my reference surface. Give it gentle downward pressure and then just glide a line down the edge of the board. And I'll probably repeat that a couple of times to get a nice deep line scored in this edge. Now so far in this series, we've done most of our marking with a pencil. And pencil lines are fine, but a scored line with some sort of a cutting tool has a couple of the big advantages. For one thing, it's more precise. A pencil is more likely to wander around. And then once you've scored a line with some kind of cutter, you've actually created a little depression in the wood. And your cutting tools are going to naturally want to fall into that depression and follow it. So you can feel the line that you cut with a marking gauge when you put a chisel against it, and if you use a saw to make a cut, it'll want to follow that line much more naturally than a pencil line. So as your work improves and you're trying to make more and more precise stuff, a marking gauge is really going to help. I often find commercially made gauges like this one at flea markets and tag sales, and I usually pay between $1 and $5 for them. So if you find one and it's cheap, buy it and don't give it any more thought. The alternative is to make a homemade gauge like this one. And it's really similar to the commercial one, and it doesn't require a thumb screw. Instead, it has this really handy little dowel locking mechanism that works just as well, but doesn't require threads and doesn't mess up the beam when you tighten it. So, if you're going to buy a gauge, grab one of these. If you're going to build a gauge, well, let's just get started. The stock you need for this project is very basic. The main thing you need are 2 hardwood dowels. One of them should be about the thickness of your thumb, and the other one should be a little bit more like a pencil, but maybe a little bit thicker than that. The best thing you can do is size your dowel stock to bits that you already have for your bit brace or your drill. That's going to make boring the mortises and getting an accurate fit really quick and easy. Of course, maybe you don't have any dowel stocks sitting around at all, and that's totally fine. You can still do this project. Get a square stick of hardwood and prepare it so it's smooth on all 4 sides. Then plane off all 4 of the corners so that you have an even octagon shape. Then plane off the corners again so your piece has 16 sides. Keep working your way around the piece, slowly taking off the high spots and refining it more and more towards round. In about 20 minutes, you can get a piece like this that's very close to being a round dowel. Now, I've only taken this to about 90% complete, but if I wanted to take another 10 minutes or so, and especially finish it up with some sandpaper, I could make a very round and smooth piece, and I could size it perfectly to whatever drill bit I had sitting around. So if you don't have dowel stocks sitting around, just make your own. The only other piece of wood I need is for the fence of my gauge, and for that, I'm going to use this piece of cherry. It's rough on one side and one edge, but the other face has already been planed flat by the lumberyard. So I'll plane one edge and check to make sure it's 90 degrees square to my face. That's going to give me two surfaces that I can use to do all of my layout. I register my tri-square against the clean edge I just made and lay out two of the lines for my fence. Now, when I go to lay out the rip cut that's going to finish my fence, I can't register my square against this edge of the board because it's too ragged. It's going to throw my square off. So I just use the beam of the square as a ruler and connect 2 points together. That way I still get a straight line and I'm not thrown off by that ragged edge. Once my layout is complete, I wedge my piece into the notch vise of my bench, cut down the one long rip cut, and then clamp the board sideways across the bench. Very carefully cross-cut off that ragged end, and finally cross-cut off the fence itself. Then I clamp a screw clamp down to my bench and use that to hold this small part steady while I plane off all the saw marks and irregularities and make it nice and straight and square. Now, I've been using this hand screw clamped down to the bench trick a lot recently, especially for small parts and stuff that I have to take in and out a lot while I check it. And I'm starting to think that this bench might actually need a vise. So let me know down in the comments if that's an addition that you'd like to see. Once you've got your fence piece made, you're going to need to lay out and bore these two round mortises, or holes. Maybe for this project, they're just holes. Anyway, get your piece immobilized. Find the center of the fence by connecting the two corners, and then get your larger bit, set it up in the center, and drill down until the spurs of the bit just score the surface of the wood. That's going to give you the layout of a perfect circle of the exact diameter of the final hole. Now you'll need to lay out the smaller hole on the side so that it intersects the larger hole just along the edge. So lay your piece of dowel on top of the fence and roll it forward until about 1/3 of the width of the dowel is covering that layout you just did. Then take a pencil and strike a line on either side of that thin dowel. Take your tri-square and carry those lines around the end of the piece. Then find center. I just did this by eye. You don't have to be too crazy about it. Put your smaller bit in your brace or drill and bore that hole all the way through. It's okay if it wanders off a tiny bit to one side or the other. The piece will still work fine. Once your hole is bored, test fit your dowel. It's probably going to be too tight, so take a piece of sandpaper and start slowly sanding and test fitting the dowel in that small hole. You can dial in the fit very carefully and have exactly what you need for a nicely functioning tool. Now, you need to drill the second, larger hole second, not first, because if you already have this hole, then it's impossible to get the little one to go through without wandering. So once the little one is all set and dialed in, put your larger bit back in the brace and go ahead and bore out this bigger hole. I don't want my hole to break out on the bottom of this piece of wood, so as I'm boring, I'm continually feeling the bottom, and when I feel the snail poke through, I take the piece of wood, flip it over, set the bit into that hole, and bore out from the other end. That gives me a really clean hole on both sides with no ugly breakout. Now my pieces are all made, and it's time to fit them together. Now we have to make all of these parts actually work together. The first problem is that if we have a perfectly round beam going into a round hole, there's nothing to keep the beam from just rotating. So as soon as you put a pin through this and try to mark something with the pin will just spin away from your work. So we're going to take our beam, lock it down in the screw clamp with a little bit of the side sticking up, and then just plane a flat along one side of the beam. It doesn't have to go very deep, but you do want to end up with a nice wide registration surface. This is going to keep the beam from rotating while we're using it. Next, take your thin dowel, slide it through its hole, and then just take a pencil and mark on the inside of the fence roughly where that round hole intersects the skinny dowel. Take it out, lock it in a clamp, and then saw down most of the way to the line. Remember, we planed that flat spot on the beam, so you're not going to have to go all the way down. You just need to cut away enough of the skinny dowel so that the flat spot can slide in there and register. Next, I'm going to take a chisel, bevel down, and come in from both directions toward my saw cut. And I'm slowly going to excavate this shape right here. Now, it's a little tricky to see on camera, so I'll make sure to include a better detail shot in the plans. But what I want is a very shallow angle from one side into my flat spot, and then a very sharp sort of right angle on the other side. And the way this is going to work is when you push in from this direction, this wedge is going to slowly push against the flat spot on the beam, and it's going to stop it from moving. When you push from the other direction, that wedge is going to let go, but this little 90-degree ridge right here, that's going to stop this pin from just dropping out. Now here's how you want your finished gauge to function. When you push on this side of the dowel, that long angle you just put in is going to engage against the beam like a wedge and keep it from moving. Just finger pressure should lock it down pretty tightly. When you push on the other side of the dowel, you want it to let go. Now this is floating freely and the beam can move in either direction really easily. Now, this isn't a super easy fit to get. It takes several rounds of fitting and chiseling and shaping before you get the fit that's easy to lock and easy to unlock. But it only takes about 20 minutes usually, and I've made a couple of these so far. None of them has been very difficult. Once your gauge is working properly, you just need to do a few things to finish it up. First, take the fence and clean up and chamfer any sharp edges or corners with your hand plane. You also might want to put a radius on the two short sides of the fence. That makes it very comfortable to hold in your hand. Then, run a saw curve down one end of your beam. Widen it up with some sandpaper and drop in a sharp tack or finishing nail and fix it in place with superglue. Superglue gives a very strong bond, but it has a low melting point. So if you ever need to get that pin out again, a little bit of heat will do the job. So at the beginning of this video, I said that our homemade gauge was actually going to be better than a fancy store-bought gauge. So let me take this expensive rosewood marking gauge and strike a line down the edge of this board. Then I'll take my homemade gauge and strike another line parallel to it. Do you see any difference between these two lines? Yeah, me neither. They're exactly the same. Both gauges work equally well, but the one we made was free, and it's got another important advantage. On the fancy commercial gauge, once you get the fence set wherever you want it to be, you've got to reach around with your other hand to tighten up that set screw. Our gauge, with its sliding pin lock, doesn't have that limitation. Once you get the fence where you want, you just take your thumb, push against that button, and your fence is locked in. If you want to lock it down even more tightly, just give it a tap against the bench. Now it's locked down super tight, and it's definitely not moving. If you have a hard time unlocking it, just take it and tap the other end of the pin against the bench. When your fence is locked down, if you find you need to make a small adjustment to the location of the pin, don't unlock it. Just grab the gauge by the fence and tap it against the bench. Tap the beam on the head end to move the pin closer to the bench, and tap the beam on the tail end to move it further away. It's very easy to make accurate, small adjustments without unlocking it, all with one hand. And this is honestly a lot better than commercial marking gauges. It's easier to use. Now, once you've made one of these, you might as well make a couple more. Make one with 2 pins in it, use it for mortises. Make one with a cutter instead of a pin and use it as a slitting gauge. Once you know how to make these, there's no reason not to make them for whatever purpose you need. They're pretty much free. I've got an excellent set of plans available if you want to build your own, and you can find those at rexkruger.com/store, where you'll also find more plans for other projects, plus t-shirts and hoodies, and that stuff really helps support the channel. So thanks in advance if you pick something up. And my patrons never have to pay for things like plans. They got these plans for free this morning. If you'd like to get free plans, plus early access to all my videos and bonus content, go over to patreon.com/rexkruger and check out all the rewards and early access that I have just for my patrons. And before I go, I'm really enjoying doing the Woodwork for Humans series, but I've done a lot of the projects that I thought up when I started it. And what I really need to know is, what do you want me to do with this series? Where are you still struggling with your woodwork? What kind of tools should we make? What kind of projects should we get into? Leave me your thoughts down in the comments about where I should take this series from here. Should I make more tools? Should I make some furniture pieces? Should I add a vise to this bench? I'm not really sure, but you know. So tell me. Anyway, thanks so much for watching.